A few weeks ago, I went to visit a friend of mine who is in a psychiatric ward, one of our hospitals. And written on the whiteboard in the dining room area of this facility were these words: "Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Therefore, be kind, always." I thought that was a really important message, because sometimes we do judge people and we make assumptions about people, and we do not know the battles that are going on in that person's life. Oliver Sacks, in one of his books, writes this: "Each of us has a biography, a story. Each of us is a singular narrative which is constructed continually, unconsciously, by, through, and in us, through our perceptions, our feelings, our thoughts, our actions, and not least, our discourse, our spoken narrations. To be ourselves, we must have ourselves, possess, if needs be, repossess our life stories. And we must recollect ourselves, the inner drama, the narrative of ourselves." In his book, The Stories We Live By, Dan McAdam tells the story of a 35-year-old mother, Margaret Sands. And at the age of 35, Margaret made a 2,000-mile pilgrimage across the United States with her teenage daughter in order to break into an abandoned chapel and rip the place apart. The two of them scaled a cyclone fence surrounding a former Catholic boarding school for girls. Margaret's daughter prized open a window and squeezed through it and ran around to the back of the building to open a door so her mother could enter. 25 years had passed since Margaret left that school. Everything looked smaller to her now, of course, but the smell was a familiar one she'd always associated with primitive loathing and fear. And Margaret brazenly pushed her way to a place where no woman had ever been allowed, behind the altar. She kicked the walls and punched the pulpit and the pews. She made blasphemous gestures to the cross and the icons, and with her car keys she carved out two rough inscriptions on the chapel's great wooden doors: "I hate nuns and they beat children." Then she calmly told her daughter, "We can leave now." And after visiting relatives and old friends, Margaret drove back to Chicago, having accomplished a mission of extraordinary personal significance. What for some people might be seen as an act of petty vandalism, for Margaret it was a sacred ritual grounded in the personal story and the myth of her life. A tragic and heroic story of, in Margaret's words, of a wasted life, but one that now affirms hope, progress, and the promise of triumph in the face of a neglected and abusive world. From 5 to 10 years of age, Margaret was in this boarding school, which she called the institutionalising of a human being. And while she received a good academic education, Margaret was regularly beaten, sexually abused, and humiliated by the nuns. These years were the defining moments of the emerging story of Margaret's life. Margaret then needed to reformulate the narrative of her life so that the story recognised the heroic achievements of her life. And this would then enable her to reach a reconciliation and accommodation with her past life, and emboldened her to move forward with energy and direction toward a future that she would be proud to create. Choosing to change your life story can be a demanding and sometimes agonizing enterprise that for many of us, of course, will require some form of therapy or counselling, some form of intervention. So what is a story? When my children were little, they would always ask me to read them a story, perhaps like Cinderella, and I would change some of the lines in the story, such as I would call Cinderella Drindasella. And when Cinderella dropped a slipper, I would say, Cinderella slopped her dripper. And they would yell, Dad, that's not the story. Children, of course, know what a story is. And we know then that a story has a setting which we normally discover early on, like in Dickens' "'Twas the night before Christmas" went all through the house. Another feature of story is that we'll have human or human-like characters. And before anything happens, we will often learn the basic certain things about the character, such as what they look like or how old they are and so on. Human beings are storytellers by nature, in many different guises, as folk tale, legend, myth, epic, history, and think of all the many and varied kinds of stories that we see in motion pictures and on our TV programs. The story appears in every human culture. Let's earth this for a moment. Think of the last time you tried to explain something really important about yourself to another person. Chances are you accomplished this task by telling a story. The healing power of story arises as a major theme in certain forms of psychotherapy, of course, whose explicit therapeutic goal is to depatholise life. The development of a coherent life story is a major goal in all therapies. And the therapist and the client seek to construct more adequate and vitalising stories about the self. One psychologist has written that mental illness amounts, at least in part, to suffering from an incoherent story or an inadequate narrative account of oneself. Some psychological problems and a great deal of emotional suffering stem from our failures to make sense of our lives through story. Therapists, of course, can help us to revise our stories, to choose a different story of our life, and to provide and to produce a healing narrative of the self. Our stories then need to be flexible and resilient, and they need to be able to change, to grow and develop as we ourselves change. Which brings us to this story of Jesus. Mark gives the following account of what happened to Jesus after his baptism. At that point, Mark says, the Spirit sent him out toward the desert. He stayed in the wasteland 40 days, put to the test there by the devil. He was with wild beasts and angels waited on him, Mark writes. There is much midrash in this story. If you know the Jewish term midrash, you know that what the writer of this gospel is doing is trying to go back into the Old Testament and show that what is happening in the life of Jesus now has occurred in other characters in the Old Testament. So, midrash. The mention of 40 days evokes the wandering of Israel in the desert. The fact that Jesus was put to the test recalls the desert exile and Isaiah's story of its transformation as the exiles returned from Babylon. And Jesus being with wild beasts evokes the temptations that are added later by Matthew and Luke in their Gospels, written round about 80 to 85 in the first century. So when we're told that the angels waited on him, we're given the reference to the desert experience of the prophet Hosea. So in Matthew's and Luke's account, the story is less about temptation and more about Jesus and the forging of his identity. Again, there are references in the temptations to the tests and temptations of Israel in the desert. The story of Jesus in the wilderness or desert involves the same themes: food, false worship, and putting God to the test. These were at the heart of Israel's experience. These temptations were alternative life stories that Jesus could have embraced. What was the defining story for Jesus in his development as a human being? He was presented with three alternatives for himself. The first story he could have chosen was a story of a self-centered life. Command this stone to be turned into bread. Live out your life in which you spend your energies and gifts serving yourself. And Jesus counters by quoting Deuteronomy 8:3, one does not live by bread alone. And then the second alternative story for Jesus to follow was he could have embraced all of the kingdoms of the world with power and dominion. All Jesus had to do was to be involved in false worship. But he refused to be diverted from what he saw as the directional story of his life, that he came as one to serve others. And in the third alternative story, Jesus is confronted with the temptation to put God to the test. Instead of trust, why don't you get proof? Instead of walking by faith, why don't you get God to demonstrate his saving power? Throw yourself down from the temple and force God's hand. Jesus, of course, rejects this life story for himself. Do not put the Lord your God to the test, he says, Deuteronomy 6:16. So three alternative life stories that Jesus could have chosen, but he didn't. And out of his personal story that Jesus had forged for himself, he knew that life was more than bread alone. He knew that as a Jew, that if he served only God, he would not put God to the test. And where did he get the moral courage to withstand the alternative stories of a future life that he could have chosen? Perhaps it was week in and week out in the synagogue with the Torah and the Jewish prayer, may his great name be blessed. May his great name be blessed, would have been said. So the power of a personal story informing our every action in life gives you and me the freedom to renounce other alternative stories that you can choose for yourself. Stories that sound and feel congruent and are authentic with the kind of person that you are and that you hope to become. Our blessing. Eternal presence and God the sender, send us. Eternal presence the sent, come with us. And the eternal presence, the strengthener of those who go, empower us, that we may go with you and find those who will call you, the eternal presence, and live out that presence in their everyday lives. Amen.